We are here with Reverend Mike McNamara, who is the pastor at Adelphi Presbyterian Church, but is also the director for the Center for Holy Imagination, which is one of the new things that we have starting in National Capital Presbytery. It is a new worshiping community, a new gathering of contemplation that's happening in downtown Silver Spring. Mike has an extensive experience and knowledge about contemplation and meditation and spiritual practices that where we are right now, we find that those are things that people are gravitating towards. We're going to have a conversation with Mike today to talk about some of those things and how you might be able to take them into your church, into your context, into your congregation, to begin to start those practices over digital platforms like Zoom or Facebook Live. So Mike, why don't you give us, share what you're about, what you've been doing, and how we might be able to take these back into our churches.
Sure, thanks, John. So we started the Center for the Holy Imagination with the idea of unlocking the great value and history that exists within Christian contemplative practice over the millennia, allowing that to be an agent of transformation in our lives. And then we also open ourselves up to practice beyond Christian tradition to create higher dialogue, to create more interaction amongst not just Christians, but all the people in downtown Silver Spring. For the last couple months, really year, we've been doing More Than Mindfulness Mondays, which is a creative mindfulness practice that we do each week. We've just this week started doing that through Zoom. We've kind of restarted it through Zoom. And we've been doing a weekly meditation class on Zoom on Fridays at 1, and have been posting videos for meditation techniques and for creative mindfulness activities that folks can do while they're stuck inside, while we have to be doing this social distancing, while we have to be finding ways to be by ourselves and to be present to what's around us in these very challenging times with people dying, with this virus spreading, with everyone just the economic fallout. This is a good time to be engaging in opportunities to be aware, to be present, to be aware of God's love in our lives and the way God moves in our lives.
So as a personal practitioner of mindfulness and contemplation, and now a teacher of this, why do you think that this is something that more people are gravitating towards right now?
Well, some of them are really basic and really straightforward. Again, as I pointed out, we are spending a lot of time in kind of the same place, and engaging in mindfulness is a great way to remain present, to be aware again of what's going on, to be paying attention to what's going on around us, and to not let our emotions get away from us, and to not try to block those emotions out, but to be present in the midst of that. So there's a very kind of base psychological level. But there's also that level of how contemplation makes room for God to move within us. If we really believe that the Spirit is something that has the ability to transform, and that it's something that doesn't happen through our own efforts, our own works, the best thing that we can do is to create that space for the Spirit to move within us. And when we find stillness, and when we find, when we rest into our solitude, when we practice meditation, contemplation, mindfulness, we are making space for God's love and God's Spirit to really move within us, to transform us. And I've found through my own practice, when we make that space for stillness, the Spirit works in surprising ways, and can really be that mode of transformation that gets us more in touch not only with who we are, but our connection to God, the way that God rests within us. And the closer we get to understanding that unity, the more effective we get at sharing God's love in the world.
So I remember when I first started doing this stuff, it seems like these are big asks. Like this is outside of my comfort zone, outside of my experience, outside of my knowledge. But the more I did it, the more I realized that this really feels at home to my soul. So for those of you watching, we're going to link to a bunch of Mike's trainings and teachings of videos that are already posted online. But Mike, what are the things you can offer as kind of dipping your toe into this?
Sure.
What are those baby steps for the person who's like, I'm not sure this is kind of my thing? What are the breadcrumbs that we can lay out to get people to say, yeah, I think I can try something like that?
So number one is intent. That's kind of the basis of all meditation contemplation. And I think that's a big difference between a lot of the secular activity we see and what we can experience within a more spiritual Christian religious context, is what is the intent that we bring into it. And if a suggested intent is to be to develop our awareness of the way that God moves within us. And again, we have to make space for that. If we're thinking too much, we don't have the time to acknowledge and be still and be present to the way that God is moving within us. So we start with that intent. What is the intent that I'm bringing to this practice? And it doesn't always have to be developing awareness, but what is the intent that I'm bringing to the practice? I'd say the second thing is that it is practice. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I'm still constantly fiddling with my technique. I'm constantly paying attention to the way that it's moving in my life. I'm always reading more. I'm always trying to kind of learn more. But again, it's not something that one perfects. It's something that one practices. And I think that's really important to remember. This isn't something that you need to be an expert in ever, let alone the first couple times that you try it. Another big thing that I think is really important when talking to people that are starting meditation is you see, well, I just can't do meditation. My mind just starts running and I can't quiet it down. That's totally normal. And it's totally what happens when you do this. So you're going to sit down for your first time and your mind is just going to start chattering and chattering and chattering. And whatever practice you use, you have to keep at it. You have to do 20, 30 minutes a day. And over time, that mind chatter will slow down. But it's really important to remember that just because of the first time or the first 10 times even, and even me every once in a while, if I have an off day, my brain is running 100 miles an hour in my head, and I have to really pay attention and slow that down. That's totally normal. And I think that for a lot of people is a big barrier into meditation and contemplation, and just being still and silent for longer than a minute or two. A really easy practice that you can do is to focus on your breath. And this is maybe the simplest meditation contemplation technique. You don't have to take extra big breaths. This isn't, we're not talking about the various ways that we breathe in yoga. All we're doing is we're just paying attention to the breath and paying attention to it coming in and out of the mouth, in and out of the nose. Really simple. The simpler, the better, typically with meditation. It's the opposite of a lot of things. As you practice more, I think the process and the practice becomes simpler. And so when we start, things tend to be a little more complicated. And as we practice more, we can simplify. But this is a great practice that I've used with lots of people, lots of first-time people, and it still is fairly effective. Just paying attention to that breath as it comes in and out of the mouth. And then what you do is, as you start to rest into stillness and you notice a thought come into your mind, and you may not notice it for a minute or two, just acknowledge that thought and then turn your mind back to your breath and focus on that breath. And you want to set a timer. A good place to start is maybe 10 minutes, even 5 minutes if you're starting is fine. But every time you notice a thought, turning the mind back to the breath and using that breath as a focal point, as a way to acknowledge the thought and then gently push that thought aside and to return to the breath. And the reality is if you're starting out in a 5-10 minute meditation, you're going to be returning to your breath maybe 30, 40 times. Like, that's normal. John, I see you nodding your head. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been there. That's normal. And I think that's the most important thing that people need to hear is meditation is not something that necessarily comes naturally to everybody, but I do think it's something that everyone is capable of. But we have to really pull back a lot of layers that have been put on us by culture, by society, by the people in our lives, by what we're taught, and a whole lot of things. So it takes practice and it takes some time and letting it work and realizing that the benefits that come may sneak up on you in a month. All of a sudden you just notice, well, I'm smiling more, little things like that. Is the side products of this practice. But again, that idea of making space.
Yeah. So, and as wrapping up this conversation, if we're trying to encourage, I'm hoping two things happen from this conversation: that more people start to take on this practice for themselves, but our leaders in the Presbytery who are watching this video then hopefully start to teach some of these things and encourage their congregation, their members who are connected digitally, to start some of these. So if someone were to start teaching or encouraging meditation and contemplation over things like Zoom, what are some of the things they should be looking out for right now in the very unique situation we find ourselves in?
I think if you're beginning to kind of, you want to start with your own personal practice and pay attention and to kind of figure it out for yourself before you start to kind of bring other people in. But the big thing just to pay attention to is acknowledging the anxiety and the fears that are coming up in the midst of all this, and that sometimes meditation has a way of it can be a very calming practice, but it can also be something that brings up emotions. And to be aware of that, particularly if you're kind of starting to lead meditation, to be aware that some things may come up, and these are incredibly challenging times. But just, again, taking that time to be still, focusing in on how do we be aware of what's going on within us? How do we be aware of what's going on around us? How are we aware of the way God's love may be moving within us, even in these challenging times? And it's very subtle. These are quiet whispers on the wind. We're not talking tablets being handed to Moses. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
But just to remember that it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes persistence, and sticking with it, even when it's challenging. And our minds are so distracted and just so kind of running in every minute, and we're also stressed out, that taking that 20 minutes every day, if you can take that 20 minutes of silence, is just a great way to kind of pull and rein some of that back in so that we can find that stillness in that center.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. Like I said, we will link to what Mike is doing if you want to follow along. I know you're on YouTube and Facebook, right? We can check into what you're offering for your community, for your context, and hopefully people start to pick up some of these things that might feel like new ideas, but these are as old as the church is itself. These are not new practices. This is ancient stuff. This is what the church is founded on. So hopefully you all watching this get a chance to try something new, to experience God in a new way, because you find yourselves now in a very new and different situation that we're not sure what we're going to look like on the other end. So Mike, thanks again. We'll make sure that we check out and follow along with what you're doing.
All right. Thanks, John.